Good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. There we go. I'm Cynthia Young, founding dean of Clemson University's College of Science and SCBIO board member. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. McMurry Heath. Dr. McMurry Heath accepted the challenge to become the CEO of BIO, the world's largest biotechnology advocacy organization, during the beginning of the pandemic in June of 2020. Her background is impressive, to say the least. The common thread in Dr. McMurry Heath's work across academia, government, and industry has been her focus, her laser focus, on broadening access to scientific progress so that more patients from diverse backgrounds can benefit from cutting-edge innovation. Prior to leading BIO, our parent organization, she held several executive leadership positions, Johnson & Johnson, the FDA during the Obama administration, and was the founding director of Aspen Institute's Health Biomedical Science and Society Policy Program, where she promoted personalized medicine and bolstered international preparation for pandemic disease threats. Dr. McMurry Heath received her MD Ph.D. from Duke's Medical Scientist Training Program. She spent 12 years conducting research as a bench scientist before being recruited into policy and leadership roles in both government and industry. This morning, she will be giving us a national perspective on leading an industry that is absolutely on the move. I had the pleasure of visiting with Dr. McMurry Heath, and I find her personally and her work so very inspirational. Would you please join me in welcoming BIO President and CEO, Dr. Michelle McMurry Heath.
Thank you so much. Rock. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I love Cynthia's energy and excitement in the morning. And I don't know about you guys, but it is great to be here in person and together. So it is so wonderful to see us opening up again, and even better to know that it is because of the science and the work that companies like the ones represented in this room are doing each and every day. So it is wonderful to be with you. As Cynthia mentioned, I joined BIO in the mid-2020, just as the pandemic was locking down. I remember my first week was George Floyd's funeral, so our entire nation was gripped by what was happening at that particular moment. And science kind of seemed like something in the background, but we knew it was so critically important if we were ever going to move forward again, and that's proven to be the case. Because I started during the lockdown, it took me months and months to meet many of my team members in person. I have not yet had an opportunity to meet so many of our state associations, and this is actually my very first state association visit. So it is an honor to be with you in the Palmetto State for the very first state visit for BIO, and many more opportunities to connect as we go forward. So I don't need to tell this audience that this is an incredibly exciting time for biotechnology. We are so engaged in fighting the pandemic, but at the same time, we haven't lost a beat in fighting all of the other biotechnology needs that our society has. Unfortunately, it's amazing to me that many people still do not understand all the work that each of your companies does. I was in a meeting probably about a year ago with the US trade representative. It was just as the Biden administration was starting. If you think about it, the US trade representative is the US global ambassador for American business. And we were having a conversation about how critical it was to get COVID vaccines to every corner of the globe, something I know that everyone in this room thinks is vitally and critically important, as do I. And one of her key staff members looked across the table at me and said, "Well, your companies have just had such success during the pandemic. I wonder, what have you sacrificed?" And it was stunning. It was stunning to think that the top office that represents US businesses around the globe felt that our companies, one, had not sacrificed during the pandemic, and I don't have to tell anyone in this audience how how deep those sacrifices went, but also would have the gall to think that our companies were enjoying the pandemic, not contributing to the cause, not bringing our nation and the globe back online. But that's the kind of misperception that we have to deal with each and every day. And it's not just restricted to Washington, D.C., it's something that we see globally, and it's something that I need each and every one of you in this audience today to join me and join Bio in fighting. So it doesn't take a lot to surprise me these days in Washington. I've been in Washington almost 20 years now, but that surprised me. And we have to, at the very least, take a deep breath and figure out how we shine a light on what our researchers and our companies do. Everyone in this room knows that your staff, your research and development teams were battling their own fears of the pandemic, their own concerns about their families, their own illnesses and risk to COVID, while they continued to come in and made sure that we made progress not just against COVID, but against so many human diseases that are still very, very important to fight. In fact, since the beginning of the pandemic, our companies have started more than 1,000 research and development programs aimed at stopping or treating COVID. Think about that. Within 24 months, our companies pivoted on a dime and started 1,000 research and development programs. Over 180 of those programs were targeted at producing a COVID vaccine. Now, if you think about how many vaccines we have today around the globe, we have less than 10, and yet 180 research and development programs were started. That's the type of yield, that's the type of success rate that our companies face every day. We want that kind of concentrated and robust effort to fight human disease, to solve humanity's problems using science. And yet it means that there's a lot of sunk costs. It means that there's a lot of research dead ends. It means that we have to try a lot of things that don't succeed. And that takes robust investment, it takes continued commitment, and it takes all of us continuing to fight together to make sure the science succeeds. So of those 1,000 projects, over 50% of them were conducted in the US. So the US alone conducted more COVID research than the rest of the world combined. And 60% of them were conducted by small and emerging companies. So if you think about that, if you are reading the Washington debates about drug pricing, they say, oh, big bad pharmaceutical companies are really standing in the way of what patients need. But in reality, there's so many small and emerging companies that are out there taking huge scientific risks, who are really operating within an inch of a margin or an inch of their fiscal life to make sure we make progress against human disease. And we need to make sure that those companies have a robust atmosphere to support their work, and we can't let it fade. We can't turn into the Europe biotech sector, where we've seen just a rolling back and a constant erosion of investment and trust in that sector. So that when they turned to fight COVID, for example, they found that they had very few biotechs really poised to be able to be successful. We have one of the best biotech ecosystems in the world, although I will say, for many of you who are already aware of this, China is quickly nipping at our heels. But we need to protect that amazing powerhouse that we have of intellect, of economy, of hope, and of the future. And I know that each of you are committed to helping Bio do that. So let me tell you a little bit about Bio. You heard in the intro that we're one of the largest biotech advocacy organizations in the world. We have over 1,000 member companies. We represent companies in over 30 countries around the world. But actually, the true strength of Bio comes from our state associations and our state affiliates. There are over 4,000 companies that are in those state affiliates in addition. And we try to work as a network to really mobilize public support and raise capital and assist with capital formation so that all of those companies can be successful. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but it is an exciting time. And we have to know that even though COVID is going to remain a part of our lives, and Bio
SCBIO continue to support efforts to fight it. We also have to help improve government, industry, and nonprofits prepare for future pandemics. And many of you know, the bio-revolution is much bigger than COVID. COVID has just shined a light on the type of work that many of our companies do, but it's the tip of the iceberg of the amazing work that's taking place in so many of our companies. So while the public can seem easily frustrated by technology's progress, by our one step forward, two step back reaction to COVID and the COVID variants, and our disappointment with COVID vaccines and boosters, even though they've saved millions of lives, can you think of other scientific innovations or any innovation that has saved millions of lives in 18 months? It's incredible. But I'm also excited about the potential future of biotechnology to heal, fuel, and feed the world. So not just in biopharma, we have amazing progress being made in agriculture, in biofuels, in climate and sustainability. So there's so much more to do. But we have to increase our ability to understand and engineer biology and to let it transform economy, societies, and individual health. So our potential is vast, with the direct economic impact of up to $4 trillion per year over the next 2 decades. So let me back up. That's a statistic I didn't make up. It came from a really in-depth report that McKinsey produced on the bioeconomy and the biorevolution that states that if we invest in biotechnology, biotechnology can deliver up to $4 trillion per year over the next 2 decades to global economies. This is a critical investment, not just for health, not just for safety, not just for our ability to feed and fuel the world, but because it is going to be the economic driver of this century. So instead of getting frustrated with technology, I like to think about the cures for cancer and rare diseases that are increasingly within our grasp. Instead of frustration, I think about biofuels that can cut greenhouse gas emissions and stave off climate change. Are you aware that United just had its first commercial flight using complete biofuels? It's incredible. And instead of frustration, I think about nutritious high-tech crops that can increase yield with fewer chemicals and at a lower cost. Can you imagine companies like Benson Hill are using CRISPR technology to engineer microcrops so that you can imagine a closed strip mall in an inner city neighborhood could actually be turned into a hydroponic farm that could grow amazingly nutritious vegetables and supply them to food deserts so that everyone can have access to nutritious foods that grow healthy minds. That's the future I imagine. A healthier, more resilient society where scientific breakthroughs re-engineer the limit of what's possible. And in today's world, where trust in science seems to ebb and flow, all of us need to speak up and advocate. We need to advocate for our research, our innovations, and the lives that we have the potential to change. That's a role that Bio is proud to play. And it's a role that we cannot play without the help of everyone in this room. So this is so critical, not just so we can change public perception about what we do, but also so that we can speak in a really compelling way to members of Congress. We stand up for science and we give a voice to those on the front lines of developing breakthroughs that enrich lives, protect the planet, and fuel this bioeconomy. We defend innovators, remove barriers to their work, and champion access to their advancements. And we're building a groundswell of support for science from the grassroots to those halls of Congress. And it's going to take that complete continuum to change how the public views what we do. And when I next see a member of the administration, I will know that we are breaking through what he doesn't ask. We are making sure that we are doing those sacrifices and that they're continued, and that those sacrifices accomplish so much. Here in South Carolina, you're playing a huge part in spurring this biorevolution and the growing bioeconomy. You're a major hub for biomanufacturing and a leading job creator for the state. Biomanufacturing is becoming the hot topic. Between this conversation about how important it is for us to consider repatriating a lot of the manufacturing that over the last 2 decades we've sent overseas, we're also starting to have conversations about advanced manufacturing and making sure that we're ready to develop the next amazing set of biotech tools like cell and gene therapy, for example. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House has just launched a new advanced manufacturing working group, and Bio is at the table to make sure that they understand the amazing progress that you're making here in South Carolina to make the U.S. a biomanufacturing hub. To that end, I want to thank South Carolina's board chair, Lou Kennedy, and your CEO, James Chappell, for inviting me to speak. It's so wonderful to join you here, and it's so amazing to hear about all the work that's taking place. I know that James is going to talk a little bit later today about the state of South Carolina's biotech industry, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But the fact that you are the fastest growing sector in South Carolina's innovation economy really testifies to your commitment to our industry's potential. And you're part of a national trend, although I will hazard a guess that you're leading it. We like to talk in this country a lot about the auto industry, which I know is vital to South Carolina's economy, and it's an indispensable part of our country. We think of it as the backbone of the American manufacturing and technical advantage. And it employs roughly 750,000 Americans, many right here in South Carolina. But most of our members of Congress would be embarrassed to say that they are introducing legislation to force car companies to sell their cars to the government at 30% of the price that they cost to make. They would be embarrassed to say that they're driving investment in the auto industry and the jobs in that industry overseas. They'd be embarrassed to say that they're forcing car companies to shutter their doors. Yet nationwide, the biotech industry directly employs roughly 2 million Americans, more than twice as many of the jobs that we see in the auto industry. And we support more than 9 million additional jobs in total in other adjacent sectors. Can you imagine? That economic impact is so much greater than what we see in the auto industry, and yet it's become almost a red badge of courage for members of Congress to disparage our industry, to say that we are fighting more for ourselves than we are for the people we serve. Our industry pays an average of $107,000 a year. That's about $50,000 more than the average wage in the broader US economy. Similarly, life science jobs here in South Carolina earn roughly 2 times the state average. This is the industry that can lead to economic progress, that can pull communities out of poverty, that can produce solutions that are not just needed here in the US, but around the globe. And yet members of Congress of both political parties feel that it's essential for them to argue on the floor of the Congress that they should shutter our doors and drive our innovations overseas. To me, that's an American tragedy. Bio fights every day to highlight this self-defeating hypocrisy. We need to support this growth at the national level by advocating for things like intellectual property protections and our innovation ecosystem. We'll fight for R&D tax credits and encourage investments in STEM education like you have here in South Carolina with your technical degree program, and many other smart policies that help you do the hard work you do every day. We also need to prioritize credits for investment in advanced manufacturing equipment and incentives to lower the cost of building advanced facilities. On the state level, across the country, we're supporting policies that advance emerging companies and push back on the efforts to limit biotechnology's huge potential. We just published our latest best practices report on what are the policies at the state level that really help states grow biotechnology hubs. And it's so gratifying to see that here in South Carolina, you've been doing many of those best practices for years. successful tools like early stage company investment tax credits for angel investors, and a partial state match for SBIR and STTR awards. This is something that South Carolina already knows and does well, and these are the practices that grow industries like ours. Similarly, states nationwide are trying to copy you. They're trying to come in your footsteps by attracting bioeconomies and biomanufacturing. And I applaud all the efforts to bring our sector and the high-paying jobs that it provides to every part of the country, especially outside of the traditional hubs in Massachusetts or California. People everywhere need to benefit from the potential of biotechnology to save and improve lives. So, that potential is critical. But back in Washington, too many leaders don't understand the benefits that we can bring. And as a result, we see efforts continuing to demonize our sector. Drug price controls or curtailing accelerated approval is something that's a hot topic right now. We got into a conversation about it at the reception last night. Some of you may not be aware, but the fluffle around the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm has created a firestorm within DC. The Food and Drug Administration has had a very successful program called Accelerated Approval for over 20 years now. It was originally started to answer the demands of HIV patients who said there were scientific breakthroughs being made that were taking way too long to make it to patients. And so they advocated for a pathway called accelerated approval, and now there's several of these pathways. These pathways help companies cut through the FDA red tape, and as an ex-FDAer, I can tell you there's plenty of that still, even in the accelerated path. But it helps companies who have a vital breakthrough get it to patients sooner. Now, Washington has decided that they want to second-guess the science at FDA. It hasn't helped that FDA has been without a commissioner for over a year, and we just last week got a permanent FDA commissioner. But they're saying they're giving permission to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, so the people who administer Medicare, to revisit FDA's approvals and require companies to do additional clinical trials post their FDA approval to gain CMS coverage. That's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. FDA has about 15,000 employees, many of them scientifically trained, who regulate 30 cents on every US dollar. They are deeply steeped in the technology and the science that each of your companies does. And even with that, they tend to fall woefully behind in having the expertise needed to catch up and understand all the work that each of you do. CMS is minuscule by comparison. I sat down with Mark McClellan, who's a former head of both CMS and FDA, last week at our New York CEO Investor Conference. And he told me that when he was at CMS leading the coverage department, he had about 75 scientifically trained staff to help him evaluate all medical products. That staff has shrunk to 40. Can you imagine 40 individuals who are supposed to evaluate all of the science that FDA does today? There is one individual in CMS that is tasked with cardiovascular. One person. I can't even imagine. So to think that this woefully underfunded, scientifically starved federal agency that is highly bureaucratic and difficult to interact with should play a role in whether or not your innovations make it to patients and then are covered is just a crime. We need to stand up and say FDA has the scientific expertise, it has the opportunity for public comment, it has the possibility to work with innovators in designing their clinical trials, and we need to support FDA's decision. And actually, if you look at the history of the accelerated approval, it hasn't just led to turning HIV into a chronic disease rather than a death sentence. It has produced amazing solutions for cancer. It's produced cures and solutions for devastating genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. And its rate of removing products from the market, because FDA doesn't have a perfect track record, nobody does, is not significantly higher than the rate for the regular approval process. So it is not letting dangerous products out to patients. It is helping desperate patients have access to needed cures in a timely manner. So this summer, when your members of Congress are helping to do the every 5-year FDA user fee negotiations on Capitol Hill, and they're talking about rolling back accelerated approval, they're talking about slowing down how your products make it to patients, we need each of you to make your voices heard, to make sure that the South Carolina delegation understands how vital it is to make sure that you have a good partner in the federal government at FDA, to make sure that your innovations make it to patients as soon as possible. So we need to do this, not just by speaking up for our companies, but making sure that our historically reluctant scientists, and as a scientist myself who sometimes misses the bench, I can say it's sometimes easy to have tunnel vision on the research project that's right in front of you. But no scientist in the US today can afford that tunnel vision. We need our scientists to get out there and talk about how critical their work is, how difficult their work is, how 9 times out of 10 their work will fail. And yet we need every one of those 10 projects to make sure we get that one that's successful. We need those 180 vaccines being developed for COVID to make sure we have 2 or 3 that we can use on a daily basis. So Bio and SCBIO serve to amplify your voice, and we're here to support those efforts. And I hope that you will do more than follow. I hope you'll use your voices to really speak up about the benefits of science and make sure that it's a part of your everyday work. Second, and this is critically important, we can no longer be seen as just producing the science. Doing our research is critically important, but today it is just as important, if not more important, to be advocating for access to those innovations. So this is not just about lowering the price. This is talking about making sure that we make it clear how much investment is needed and required to have successful scientific output. And then sitting down as a society to figure out how we're going to cover those costs. Patients should not be bearing those costs. If you think about prior approval, prior authorization, deductibles, formularies, donut holes, all of those techniques are specifically designed to drive down utilization. That's a euphemism for saying that we are trying to prevent patients from taking their doctor's advice. That is the shameful practice. We need to make sure that we are doing nothing to hinder a patient following their doctor's advice. When a prescription is written for them, it's not a nice to have. It's considered essential to their health and to their future. And we need to do everything as a culture to make sure they get it. We've done this with COVID vaccines, for example. You do not pay for your COVID vaccine when you go to the pharmacy or to the local grocery store that's administering the vaccine, because we know it's critical to the function of our country that everyone gets access to this vaccine. But it doesn't change the fact that it took hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to get us to that point in the research. The federal government chipped in some, but actually private investment far outstripped what the public sector invested. But we came together to figure out how we can make sure we pay for the innovation, but give patients the innovations they need. So let me conclude by saying a little bit about a story about a pig heart, just to give you the examples that really kind of bring home the magic of what we do. This last January, a man named David Bennett needed a new heart to keep him alive. He was too ill to receive a human transplant, so doctors applied for an experimental procedure, and the FDA gave emergency authorization to a transplant of a pig heart. As you might imagine, it wasn't just any heart. This so-called xeno heart came from a pig that had received 10 gene edits by scientists at Revicor, a biomember. Moreover, the human immune response to the heart was suppressed using an experimental drug produced by another biomember, Kanika, a pharmaceutical company. Today, David is alive thanks to genetic engineering and advances in medical science, technology that has the potential to help millions more. Stories like this one, curing a rare disease, bringing healthy, genetically engineered foods to underserved communities, our fight against COVID, are why I came to Bio in 2020, and it's why you do what you do each and every day. So it's a challenge that I have proudly accepted, and I know you have as well, and we need to make sure we continue to embrace it with open arms. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for the work that you're doing every day, for the lives that you are impacting and changing, and invite you to be a voice of science at this critical time. Together, let's speak up for science and the lives it can change. That is the challenge ahead of us right now, and a challenge I know we're all up for. Thank you.
Let's take a seat and continue the discussion. Thank you so much for those comments. We're privileged to be a part of Bio. I think the last time we spoke, we were in our home offices.
Yes.
It's good
There's
to
a
be,
lot of that these days.
right. It's good to be back out and in person. So let's get right to it. David's story that you just mentioned is a great reminder of, like you said, why we do what we do. And also that you can lose sight of that entire perspective when you're at the bench in the lab. We're pleased that the path has led you to direct Bio and be with us here today. Speak up for science is what we're talking about. You talked about a range of issues that we should be aware of. Is there one you didn't mention, or one we can dive in a little bit more that you and Bio are speaking up for right now in DC?
Yeah, definitely. I think this question of whether or not the products and the science we create is actually dangerous, should not be trusted, as one that I just alluded to, but I think it's so critically important. And the only way for us to really improve that understanding and appreciation of science is for each of us also to make sure we're involved in educating the next generation. Science education has taken such a hit during COVID. I have a 10-year-old daughter. And, we learned about 30 years ago that science is best taught experientially. You need to be at the bench as early as possible. You need to see science in action. You need to go to science museums. And yet that has never been more difficult. In the last 2 years, so many schools have gotten rid of their laboratory time, or they've rolled back their opportunities to really experience science in a hands-on way. And my concern for the next generation is they won't have that magic enchantment with science that so many of us got a chance to get at an early age. So we're going to have to work double time coming back out of the pandemic to reignite that spark. I think it's critically important.
Well, I'm glad that you've said that, because we're taking action here at SCBIO to do just that. I know many of you know about a gaming app that we're even working on. So we're excited about that and science. I know we're running close on time, but I did want to ask you, and you noted about the growth of the life sciences outside the hubs. We all know about Boston and San Diego, and you even talked about that South Carolina's positioned well for manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think we ourselves maybe not recognize that.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I think manufacturing has been almost a neglected part of the pipeline. It's been a part that's considered not where the real innovation is. And yet, actually, the real needed innovations, a lot of the newest innovations are coming in the manufacturing space. And that's why the White House, for example, is focused on this advanced manufacturing question. It's not just that we need to repatriate a lot of the types of manufacturing we've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years. It's that we're going to need a whole new set of tools to manufacture scientific solutions at scale. If you think about cell biology, if you think about gene therapy, these are technologies that are not only incredibly difficult to come up with, but they're even more difficult to produce for patients all around the globe. And so we need American ingenuity focused on this manufacturing piece, and it's so critically important. And the supply chain shortages we've seen around the globe even shine a brighter light on this. A lot of people talk about the shortage of COVID vaccines in countries around the world, but it's actually been a problem of getting the raw materials needed to produce a lot of these vaccines. mRNA vaccines have over 140 raw components and materials needed to produce a COVID mRNA vaccine. And yet many of those materials were not available in countries like India and in parts of Africa, where there actually were licensing agreements set up to produce the vaccines, but they didn't have the pipette tips and even the plastic bags and the cell culturing materials that they needed to be able to really take advantage of that intellectual property. So the rate-limiting step in biotech is increasingly manufacturing, increasingly the supplies needed to get to the end goal. And so I think South Carolina is to be applauded for having such strength in that area.
Well, that's music to our ears, I could tell you. And then I know while we have you here as well, you are familiar with our new FDA commissioner who has come back again. Can you just talk a little bit about what his leadership you think will bring?
Yeah, so Rob Califf is a lovely individual and a very committed scientist. Oops. There we go. Can you hear me if I hold it like this?
Yes,
Yeah,
do that, okay.
I think many of you will enjoy working with him if you're not already familiar with him. You know he taught at Duke for many, many years. He's a Duke cardiologist, a very charming gentleman, as well as a committed scientist. You'll see him focus quite a bit on clinical trial evolution, so that's something to pay attention to. We want to make sure that he doesn't forget about the power of real-world evidence and rolling out our medical innovations sooner in an everyday clinical setting, so that we can get to real answers sooner. We've had this obsession, thank you, thanks so much. We've had this obsession with randomized controlled clinical trials. We think that that is the gold standard of how you test a medical product. And yet, the dirty little secret within FDA is actually RCTs never match the performance of the drug when it's actually used out in the wild. When you actually are in a clinical setting where people have comorbidities, where they're taking multiple medications, the drugs never perform as those trials predict. And so it's very important, it behooves us to say what will predict performance in a more reliable way, and that's actually real-world clinical data. So if we can get to the point where we can capture that data more quickly and act on that data, then we can actually get solutions to patients sooner in a way that builds confidence and gives us confidence in the projected performance.
Well, thank you so much for providing the insight to all of us here today. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Michelle McMurry Heath.